Well, as Clint Eastwood famously once said, it's halftime in America, but week 5 in the NFL just getting started. You could argue it still hasn't started for Washington. Here to break down the rest of the slate from a betting perspective, thrilled to be joined this week by Ed Feng. Ed is a predictive analytics expert, the founder of the Power Rank, the author of the Power Ranks email newsletter. He also runs a great podcast, The Football Analytics Show, and you can find him on Twitter at the Power Rank for football betting with a PhD edge. Ed, welcome back to Props and Hops. I would mention your grad school alma mater, but don't want to embarrass you right off the top here with maybe some guilt by association given the state of Stanford football.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, Matt. Excited to talk.
Likewise. And for those of you with us live on Twitter and YouTube, if you want to join the conversation as well, feel free to jump in the chat with any questions or comments. We'll look to work those into the show when possible. Ed, I know you've had several appearances on the show over the years, largely, if not exclusively, focused on college basketball and March Madness. So I think this is an overdue first NFL episode with you. And to kick it off, we're now just about a quarter of the way through the season. What would you say have been your biggest betting takeaways so far in this NFL campaign?
Oh, man, I think probably the first betting takeaway is that things have been kind of crazy, right? Like we expected Arizona, for example, to be definitively the worst team in the NFL. That was not only something in my numbers, but a take that a lot of other pros that I respect had. That really hasn't been the case. It's not like they're doing fantastic in the win-loss column. But one thing that I will do at the Power Rank is I will take a bunch of different metrics, success rate, even margin of victory in games. I'll adjust for strength of schedule, and I'll put them together to get some sense of how a team is doing only based on the data this year. Arizona's 12th, which is a minor miracle, so just a lot of unexpected things. Everyone thought the Los Angeles Rams were going to be terrible. And, they're actually, I think, top 5 when you look at those numbers from only this season. I think there's a lot of regression coming for both those teams. But, I feel like it's been a pretty wild ride so far. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to get back to what we expected sooner. But, yeah, I think it's been a pretty unexpected, pretty wild season. And we'll see how it goes in the future.
I feel like the abnormality would be to one time be a month into a season and not feel like everything is crazy, because every year, different specifics, but the general through line seems to be that a month into any season, we can almost throw out altogether whatever we thought we'd expect going into the season from a league-wide standpoint. And I'm glad you hit on the Cardinals, Ed, because they were the last team I ruled out when it came to a team to feature, looking at a side to bet on this week's slate. So while I'm not going to back the Cardinals at the current number, I would like to get into sides looking at the week 5 board and see if there's a side that stands out to you on this week's slate.
Yeah, there's definitely one that my numbers have Tennessee and Indianapolis as essentially a pick. I think I have Indianapolis by about a half point. I am not a fan of Tennessee. They are not good in any of the passing metrics that I've been looking at. Ryan Tannehill is a quarterback that I actually have not trusted for longer than most people haven't trusted him. Even when he was kind of considered one of the best quarterbacks in the league, there was a lot of things that were kind of, pulling him back to NFL average. And I've been against Tennessee. That didn't really work out for me last week, as statue Joe Burrow and his calf couldn't really move at all. But I also like what's going on with Indianapolis. Anthony Richardson has been pretty good as a rookie, and that's something I'm not really surprised at. I had Matt Waldman, fantasy football expert, on my show. He is a tape grinder, and he was so impressed with Richardson at Florida. And it wasn't something that the numbers bore out. Like the Florida offense wasn't particularly great last year, but what he saw on tape was someone that was an elite learner, that really had an elite brain. And, we're kind of seeing that with this Indianapolis team. I also think a lot of my metrics had them as the 30th best team in the NFL to start that season. And when I look at the personnel on that team, even without Richardson, that seems way too low. So, Indy was favored earlier this week. It has shifted all the way back to Tennessee by 2.5. I think you can grab Indianapolis plus 2.5 I think at FanDuel this afternoon when I checked it. So that is the side that I like for week 5.
All right, and that number does look to be pretty much painted across the board at Tennessee -2.5. So yeah, those Colts +2.5 widely available. And to no surprise to any regular listeners, when we talk teasers in a bit, that is a game that I will be touching on. But Ed, one side I want to run by you from my perspective. I'm seeing what I consider to be a lot of tight lines on the board this week, but I like Minnesota +3.5 against Kansas City. The Vikings hosting that one, and that could be a big factor. Any home field advantage these days seems to be minimal compared to what it once was. Minnesota, one of the few teams that still has a fairly strong home field edge. And beyond that, going to give a hat tip here to Sharp Clark on the Move the Line pod. He broke this down as well, noting that the Vikings are the most blitz-heavy team in the league. And that could be a big red flag in this matchup because historically Patrick Mahomes has shredded the blitz. But Sharp Clark pointed out that that's largely been via leaning on his wide receivers in Kansas City. And that wide receiver core this year, probably weaker than it's ever been in the Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid era. On the other side of the ball, the Vikings have had some unsustainable bad luck with turnovers offensively. Adam Chernoff on the RAS app noted after the Vikings-Panthers game last weekend, Minnesota now has 5 turnovers inside their opponent's 5-yard line this season. That's more than 1 turnover a week from inside the 5. It's tough for me to wrap my head around that. And beyond that, 8 turnovers so far this season for Minnesota inside the opponent's 25-yard line. So just about fringe red zone territory and 2 turnovers a game. I don't see how that can last. I think with the Vikings getting some of their key offensive linemen healthier, looking at positive regression in the turnover department, looking at this matchup as a whole, it's tough to bet against the Chiefs, knowing Patrick Mahomes is as good as he is, but I like Minnesota to keep it within a field goal. Ed, any thoughts on Minnesota +3.5 hosting Kansas City?
My numbers have Kansas City by 5. I think this is one of those games in which like my metrics are probably leaning more on preseason priors. Look, Kansas City has not been the same type of offense. I'm really trying to dig in and figure out like what the heck is going on. It hasn't been the team that we have expected. They're not as good in passing success rate as they've been in the past. Patrick Mahomes is actually putting the ball in dangerous positions a lot. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's kind of a strange 4 games so far. So, but I do expect them to bounce back, right? Like all the tools are there. Like Andy Reid has always figured it out, and I expect them to do that as well. And, I mean, it's interesting with Minnesota with the bad luck because obviously they had so much good luck last year, record in 1-score games, so on and so forth, right? Through the course of the season. I really spent some time trying to like Minnesota this preseason. I was not high on Detroit. I think I'm eating some crow on that one. I didn't think Green Bay was as good as everyone else thought they were this preseason. And I really wanted to dig in and like bet some Minnesota to win that division. And I just couldn't do it. Like I feel like it's Justin Jefferson and not a lot of other supporting cast there. So, I mean, I would probably stay away from it. I just don't think Minnesota is particularly talented. I mean, I know they haven't had the best of luck lately. I think it's more likely that kind of Kansas City bounces back and becomes a team that we know that they can be. So yeah, that's my take on that game.
All right. Well, we will see if we can find some mutual agreement as we continue to work across the Week 5 slate. And at this point, we'll move into teasers. Ed, I know that that's not necessarily in your wheelhouse, but I will give a bit of a breakdown here and see what you think. And to start for this week, I'll just say that last week, the beauty of teasers was on full display with both the Eagles and the Chiefs winning by 3 on the nose. So again, not to be too robotic or mechanical here, but the value of teasers typically comes crossing through those key numbers of 3 and 7, laying -120 or less. This week, we've got 3 fits on the board as it sits on Thursday evening. Houston +7.5 at Atlanta. Indianapolis +8.5 hosting Tennessee. As you touched on earlier, you like the Colts outright in a straight bet +2.5, but you could tease the Colts up to +8.5 at home against the Titans. And a third option would be the Jets +8.5 at Denver. Usually when we have several options like this, I try to approach it as some sort of process of elimination. And it's hard to fault any of these 3 looks in my book. I will say a slight tiebreaker would be that Circa currently shaded toward -3 for Denver. I like a cleaner cross through the 3. So I'll call my best bet as far as teasers go this week. Houston plus 7.5 at Atlanta, paired with Indianapolis plus 8.5 hosting Tennessee. And one thing I like about this, we've got some low totals in both games, 41.5 for Texans Falcons and 43 for Titans Colts. So that really, I think, magnifies the relative value of each point we get in a teaser. Ed, any thoughts on teasing up through a touchdown both the Texans and the Colts on this week's card?
Yeah, certainly like that. I mean, I've definitely talked about my take on the Colts. Fabian Suma came on my show and talked about liking Texans +2. I don't think any more +2s out there right now. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly sitting at the right number. I'm not a fan of Atlanta at all. I know there are some particular matchups that some people have liked, but yeah, I think those are two really great teaser legs.
All right, and I will say unofficially, two really good teaser legs. The Jets, again, it's hard to fault them. So I would say kind of like last week, an unofficial 3-teamer hit with Tennessee, Philadelphia, and Kansas City. I cannot fault the notion of teasing Houston, Indianapolis, and the Jets. That would be a 3-team 6-point teaser. Look for plus 170 or better on that. And just a note about bankroll management. If you are looking to play Houston and Indy and multiple teasers, manage your exposure on those two teams accordingly. Ed, we've covered sides and teasers, and now I'd love to get into props and kick off this segment by noting that I've noticed this season, it seems like you're starting to corner the market when it comes to one prop in particular, and that would be quarterback interceptions. And I'm just wondering what goes into your process in terms of finding an edge in that quarterback interception prop market.
It goes back to COVID in 2020. I had some time because there was no sports going on, and I really dug into the question, can we predict turnovers? And what I found was that you can do a better job with interceptions than simply looking at interception rate. Interception rate tends to not be predictive. I think part of the reason is because those events are so rare. What happens is that if you look at a bigger set of events, so if you look at interceptions plus passes defended, or anytime the defense gets their hand on the ball, I call that sum bad ball, and then I call bad ball rate is certainly just interceptions plus passes defended divided by total attempts. And what I found was that bad ball rate is about as predictive as any quarterback statistic gets. So my process is simply looking at bad ball rate and projecting that onto an interception rate, doing a little bit of math to figure out the probability of whether a quarterback is going to go to throw a pick or not. The market's always set at half a pick. And yeah, and obviously doing a little bit of handicapping on top of that as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So I've actually gotten, I had one bet week one. Things were kind of busy, so I didn't really, I didn't have any more than that. And it's steadily, I've been getting more on top of things and looking at every quarterback in every game. Had a lean on Sam Howell to throw a pick tonight, which already happened. And that's kind of interesting too. Maybe we could talk about that, right? Because he doesn't have a ton of pass attempts, right? He's a young player. With Patrick Mahomes, we know what his track record is. We know what Andy Reid's track record is with interceptions, with bad balls, and it's very good. We don't really know with Sam Howell. So when Sam Howell has a bad ball rate of, I think, in excess of 13%, and that's bad. The NFL average is 11.6%, to give you some perspective. And but when I looked at it and I was like, okay, well, I can kind of guess how many I'm going to take how many attempts that Sam Howell's going to throw based on the markets. But let's not take, like, there's a lot of noise in his actual statistics. Let's just assume that he's NFL average. I do not think he's NFL average. I think he's going to be worse than NFL average in terms of taking care of the football. But let's just assume he's NFL average. When you did that, I think I came up with like 52% that he was going to throw a pick tonight. And so, I sent out to my members, let's lean towards the over, because the probability of his throwing a pick was plus 100. So just a lean there, having to cash. So happy for that. But that's kind of how I handicap it, right? With the quarterbacks that have been starting for 3 years, I'll just take their true numbers. If it is a quarterback that doesn't have as many attempts, I will just try to assume the best for that quarterback and see how the number compares to that. Desmond Ridder was also another example. Heading into last week, he had thrown one career interception. He had an unsustainable 0.5% interception rate, which didn't, which doesn't make sense, right? So, but the only way I could get to the market number was to assume that he was Patrick Mahomes, and that was still even. That was still like I think there was still like maybe a percentage point or two of value there, and he's not Patrick Mahomes because there's only one Patrick Mahomes. So that was in 5 Nugget Saturday. Desmond Ridder to go over, and by the time I checked my phone on Sunday morning, he had tripled his career interceptions, so that was nice. So that's my process. Like I feel very good about the numerical model, but I don't try not to just go with that. I try to do some handicapping as well. And watch some games and try to look for some tendencies.
So it sounds like we've got a fair mix of both quantitative and qualitative data informing the process here. And you might have teased this earlier when you were talking about Patrick Mahomes. I'm going to ask if we can spare the audience some of the math that you apply to this process and see if there's a favorite prop that you've identified for week 5.
Right. I actually haven't identified any. I usually end up doing this Friday morning if the market get a little bit mature. But I do want to talk about Jalen Hurts. So this is someone that we were on the over last week. He did not throw an interception, but his tendency in the game against Washington was to push the ball down the field to A.J. Brown, which makes a lot of sense because it's A.J. Brown. But it's Jalen Hurts, who I don't believe is the most accurate quarterback out there. He wasn't terrible in terms of bad balls necessarily, but there were often times where he was trying to go deep to A.J. Brown, and a Washington defender was closer to the ball than Brown was. I would be very surprised. I think the price for Hurts to throw a pick is going to be similar to last week. I really liked it last week. It didn't win, but I would be shocked if I were not on Hurts again to throw a pick this week.
And you mentioned that these are always priced at over under a half. So the juice is really a determining factor for whether or not to pull the trigger. No, it's early on for your process looking at the week 5 slate, but is there a number that you are anticipating when you speak of having an early lean on Hurts over half an interception? Any ballpark for the juice that you'd expect to lay for that prop?
Well, I mean, a lot of these quarterbacks, like you're getting positive returns on over a pick. So I mean, I think Hurts was plus 135 last week, and I'm coming up with numbers like it's 54% for him to throw a pick. So, quite a bit of value in a lot of quarterbacks. I've been actually surprised that most of the bets are on the over. That's not what I expect. But maybe it is what you expect, right? Because like over on a pick is kind of like a bad thing. You're kind of like rooting against people, right? Which is kind of the equivalent of like betting the under on a receiver. So maybe that does make sense. I don't know. Tend to be on the over. And
all right, yeah.
So like what I often see is that the price will be, plus 130, even plus, I think Ridder was like plus 145 last week to throw a pick, and when you estimate the probability, it ends up being, often over 50%.
I like the point that you made about basically fading human achievement with an over in the interceptions market for quarterbacks. So I hear you there on that, often equating with unders or bets that a lot of bettors typically don't like to place. And Ed, while it's important to know that there are two sides to the coin and we can bet unders or bet against human achievement, there are times where it can also make sense to bet on a certain player or team to achieve good things. And while we've covered good ground in the side, teaser, and prop markets, I understand that there are also a couple of futures that you've identified where you see some value at this stage of the season. So why don't you take it away with a couple looks in the NFL futures market?
Right. I mean, I've been having a lot of fun with the unabated simulator. I can put in my member numbers, which I strongly believe in. And I did that this week. And one of the interesting things that popped up was Jacksonville futures. Jacksonville is a team that looks pretty good on offense in my numbers, top 10 team when I look at adjusted passing success rate. What was surprising was that their defense has been better than last season. And, they're better when I look at adjusting passing success rate. Their PFF coverage grade is actually top 10 this year. Unfortunately, defensive performance tends to be more volatile than offense, but still at this point in the season, you're just looking for a good signal that your defense is better. Like it was pretty bad last year, despite their success, despite making it to the playoffs. despite having that comeback win over the Chargers in the playoffs. So I was kind of high on Jacksonville, and it was nice to see the numbers spit out that there was value on them to win the division. I think you can grab plus 150 on FanDuel for Jacksonville to win the division. And basically what the simulator is seeing is that Jacksonville is ranked 10th or 11th or, borderline top 10 team in my numbers. And the remaining 3 teams in the division are, I think, 27th, 28th, and 29th or something like that. Bottom 8 teams. And it's a situation in which Houston and Indianapolis have actually been upgraded by my numbers since the beginning of the season. I think we all can understand that and see that with what's going on with how they played. Tennessee's kind of about the same, maybe downgrade a little bit, but there's just a big gap between the bottom 3 teams and Jacksonville. That's what my numbers are seeing with the unabated simulator. So plus 150 for them to win the division, I think is a bet with a lot of value.
And then I believe there's also an angle on the Jags to make the playoffs. Of course, if they win the division, they would make the playoffs by default. But just in case, maybe there's a cushion looking that way as well as a wild card team potentially.
I think so. Let me see. Let me make sure I'm getting you the right number.
Sure. Last I saw was minus 110 on the Jags to make the playoffs. So a bit of a price differential, but there's that safety net just in case they don't win the division, but do still sneak into the playoffs.
Right. Yes. I have written down minus 110 to make the playoffs at DK. Value on that according to my numbers.
All right. And when you talk about the big gap you see between the Jags and the other 3 teams in the division, I would like to dig in just a bit further on Houston and Indy. You mentioned the rookie quarterbacks, and for pretty clear reasons, through 4 weeks, the Texans and Colts have been upgraded in the eyes of the market. How do you wrestle with the fact that there is a big gap by your numbers right now between the Jags and the rest of the division, and also the fact that especially the Texans and Colts could be pretty high variance teams, given that we've seen generally positive things from CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson, but it's only 4 weeks, and there are still a lot of unknowns there. If the unknowns work out negatively for those 2 teams, that could give the Jags an even easier path to the division title. But if some of those unknowns break positively in Houston and or Indianapolis, that could make it tougher sledding for Jacksonville and the AFC South.
Oh, absolutely. But like, let's consider the ceiling for what Jacksonville, let's consider the ceiling for Houston and Indianapolis. Like if they are like pushing NFL average, that's a great season for both of those teams. Right. And even if they are pushing NFL average, I still think Jacksonville is better than NFL average. I still see some value there. It's interesting. I actually got some email replies today saying, you don't like CJ Stroud as an NFL quarterback? Are you not impressed with what he's done this season? And I was like, no, not at all. I've said I've liked CJ Stroud even since his Ohio State days. I thought he was a fantastic quarterback. It's just like, it's only 4 games, guys. Let's see some more games. That's all. It's just a small sample size. So let's just be cautious with like an offense that we didn't think had a lot of weapons coming into the season. They've obviously done great, particularly the last 2 games, but it's only 4 games.
Speaking of small sample size, this is the part of the show where I'd usually work in some sort of a bet to break down, courtesy of our mutual friend Adam Chernoff with the Right Angle Sports team. Oftentimes he's given a prop for the purposes of this show. This week, though, I'd like to get into a rapid fire on how you rate 4 teams that have surprised so far this season, for better or worse. Again, it's early, so things could regress positively or negatively. But Ed, let's look to spend about 30 seconds on how you rate each of these teams, starting with a few pleasant surprises. First off, the aforementioned Indianapolis Colts. What do you make of them, what we've seen so far this season, and how that informs what you expect from them moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of crawling out of the. I was gonna do something, Matt, where like I would just give you off the cuff what I thought of the team without looking at my numbers and what they said. But unfortunately, I've looked at my numbers on what this team says. Yeah, I mean, I kind of like Indy. I've actually been someone that thought Indianapolis was horrendously overrated a couple years ago when everyone was singing the praises of Chris Ballard and all he had done, and all I saw was a defense that wasn't particularly good. And but now, I think they're on the rise. I think I mentioned earlier that they were 30th in some of my preseason metrics. I think that was way too low. So, I think their ceiling is that they're a top 20 team in the NFL. They're not quite there yet. I wouldn't rate them there yet, but that's maybe their ceiling for this year.
How about the Los Angeles Rams?
Oh, so they started really low, and obviously they've done pretty well. No Cooper Kupp, but Puka Nacua has been a revelation. And they've been doing pretty well on both sides of the ball. I think I would have them rated close to NFL average. I would say probably on the bottom side still, just because my metrics tend to still weight preseason quite a bit. Let me look at where I have them. Yeah, I'm 23rd, so even a little bit lower than that. I am still it's a little bit weird for me to see my numbers having some value on Philly this week. Philly was a team that was really good last year, the type of team that got a point or two extra compared to most number systems because they were one of the preeminent teams in the NFL. That doesn't seem like the case anymore. And part of that is the Rams. They've just been a lot better than anyone expected.
One more team that's exceeded all reasonable expectations thus far. Ed, what do you currently make of the Arizona Cardinals?
Right. I mean, I'm still going to have them as a bottom 5 team. I'm not moving too far off that prior. They have looked good. I think I mentioned that just by the data this year that they're 12th in the NFL. I'd be shocked if I had them out of the bottom 5. And they're actually still at the bottom. Interesting.
The very bottom, 32 out of 32.
Very bottom. Very bottom. I mean, there's some reasons. There's some market data mixed in there as well. And so that's going to be something that's a little bit slower to react. They're still at the bottom.
Are priors still a factor there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah, with some teams, it makes sense to hold on to priors longer than others. I feel like the more unknowns we have, the quicker it might make sense to release some of that data to anchor things too strongly. But understood with where you have 3 pleasant surprises thus far, the Colts, Rams, and Cardinals. To round this out, Ed, one unpleasant surprise, the Cincinnati Bengals. Where do you currently rate them?
Yeah, coming into the season, definitely top 5, Super Bowl contender. I mean, I'm still going to have them in the top 10. I obviously that is not something that is realistic if Joe Burrow plays like he did last week, right? I mean, you can't rate that team that high. The defense is down a little bit from what they were last year. I thought last year was just a particularly good year for that defense, given that the talent that they had as well. I definitely think that helped them on their run. I'm still going to have them in the top 10, though. Yeah, I have them 7th. That's probably too high in Burrow's current condition.
So you have the Bengals currently 7th, the Cardinals still in the basement at 32nd. And we're looking at a surprisingly short line if you have any stock in priors or look ahead lines. Bengals laying 3 at Arizona. I know you didn't highlight that game when we were talking sides. Any interest in possibly playing Cincinnati based on your numbers, or any reason why you still have that one perhaps categorized as a stay away?
Yeah, I'm staying away. I saw one of the bigger groups released it today. I mean, I can't do it before I see Burrow be a little bit mobile and not be as bad as he was against the Tennessee defense that I don't think is very good.
All right. Makes a lot of sense. I will remind the audience at this point that I am partnering with the team at Right Angle Sports this season in an affiliate capacity. And when deciding to do so, I thought about why we're here doing this show in the first place. And that is largely to highlight the best betting information from the sharpest sources. And with its team of pro sports bettors, Right Angle Sports has built a reputation as the gold standard for picks. This season, they're offering something for everybody from the NFL to college football, and now their college basketball package is available. So if you're interested in trying their pick service, you can support Props and Hops by supporting Right Angle Sports. I've got a custom link I created, tinyurl.com/RAS picks. If you're checking us out via YouTube or in podcast form, that link is in the show notes. On Twitter, you can find that link in my bio. Ed, I know you've been betting for a while and you have some contacts within the Right Angle Sports team. Any thoughts on the work that they do and the service they provide for people who do choose to buy their picks?
Yeah, I mean, Raz is incredible. Their record speaks for themselves, and I know a lot of people very well that work over there, and I'm always impressed with the effort and then just the number of pros that they put together that have seen everything. every high and low of betting on sports. So yeah, I mean, I really respect the work that they do over there.
All right. Well, thank you for the kind words. And if that's a nudge for anybody, go ahead and check out, again, tinyurl.com/RASpicks, or check the link in the show notes. Ed, now that we've talked about sides, teasers, props, futures, I want to give a rapid fire rundown. We can think of this as the props and hops week 5 portfolio for the NFL. As far as sides go, Ed is on Indianapolis +2.5 hosting Houston. I'm on Minnesota +3.5 hosting Kansas City. As far as teasers go, the best bet would be Houston +7.5 at Atlanta, paired with Indy +8.5 hosting Tennessee, and maybe an unofficial bonus teaser, 3-team 6-pointer at +170 or better, Houston +7.5, Indy +8.5, as we've mentioned, plus the Jets +8.5 at Denver. As far as props go, nothing really firmly locked in at this point, but Ed, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're leaning toward Jalen Hurts over half an interception, especially if that line comes in the ballpark of +135. Does that sound about right?
That would be great. Yep.
All right, so we will keep our eyes peeled for that. By the time a lot of the audience is catching this conversation, that may be widely available, so go ahead and keep an eye out. And then as far as futures go, Ed also has identified value on the Jaguars to win the division at +150 and to make the playoffs at -110. Ed, beyond all the picks we like to cover on this show week in and week out, I also do like to try to keep things process oriented wherever it makes sense. And in this case, I know that you are a very data oriented handicapper when it comes to your expertise using analytics in a predictive fashion. So something we kind of touched on earlier, how do you balance the quantitative aspect of this with qualitative information to find as much value as possible when you're making betting decisions on the NFL?
I mean, it's a case-by-case basis, but, I mean, I'll just go back to what I said about Jalen Hurts, and, the numbers certainly like him to throw a pick, but from what I saw last week, a lot of passes down the field, trying to get the ball to A.J. Brown, whether he was covered or not. Those are the type of things that I try to get from watching the games, and, and those lead to ideas, right? I mean, so, maybe the interception rate's probably higher on throws with more air yards. So maybe that's something that gives me, idea to go study and go dig that out of the data and see how much that is true, and maybe make my interception model better. So it's always a combination of both. I don't like to make a bet without knowing something about the players, and I mean, it's pretty easy. I guess that's pretty easy in the NFL, but it's always a combination for me.
All right, so safe to say it's both an art and a science, and I think that label can apply to our next topic as well. Ed, something we both love, the hops. I like to think great minds drink alike, and when it comes to craft beer or the old-fashioned, you and I are speaking the same language there. What have you been enjoying more regularly than not these days?
I was in Milwaukee for a soccer game with my son. So this was actually not a tournament. It was a league game. So he joined a bigger club this year. And so we go to Milwaukee sometimes for a league game. And we walk in and we're playing Bavarian United. I think that's the name of the club. And we walk in and there's some soccer fields, and I drop them off. And there's an entire German brewery there. They actually had a whole section of, like, right next to the soccer field that was an Oktoberfest. I didn't end up going in there, but I ended up going into the brewery, and the guy was super nice. He's like, you might as well buy the liter because it's only marginally more than the half liter. And I was like, sure. And
Plus
so
EV, might as well.
Exactly. And so I'm sitting there with a couple other parents and have a liter of beer. It was the Oktoberfest. It was delicious. Like it just sparkled with German purity laws. Really enjoyed it. So anyways, we go out to the game, and I was telling the other parents, like, do not let me talk to the refs in my inebriated state. So luckily the game ended up being kind of a snoozer for our team. We ended up winning 7-0. So refs were never an issue. Ended up going back into the brewery. The food was delicious as well. Like they deep fried this pork leg. It was like one of the things on there.
Wow.
Never really had that. Like they actually like deep fried the pork skin, which I kind of had a taste of, and then decided, it's probably a few too many calories for me. There's plenty of pork in here that was delicious. But really good food as well. So it was an awesome all around experience. was not expecting to go to a German brewery for this soccer match, but it was there, and we had a really good time.
Yeah, geez, speaking of pleasant surprises, a few of those teams we touched on earlier, that sounds like the ultimate pleasant surprise when you're taking your son to a soccer match. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I will be at an Oktoberfest celebration in my small town that they host annually. So once again, when it comes to the hops, we are right there in the same lane. Looking forward to seeing how we can bring our collective hop worlds together at the next Bet Bash, but that's a ways away, so we'll keep the focus on what's in front of us for now. Ed, also want to weave in the Malinsky Minute to this conversation, and when I think about the way Dave operated and a lot of what you do, I see some parallels in the sense that you are, not just a handicapper, not just a bettor, not just a writer, not just a podcaster. You cover a lot of bases, and when I think of some people listening to this conversation who might be in the aspirational stage when it comes to betting or creating content, what would you share about how you go about covering all those bases without compromising too much on quality?
I think it's tough, right? I mean, especially there's a lot of times, especially right around now, where I feel like I'm stretched to be able to bet on both college football and the NFL. I think the best thing that I've kind of done over the last couple of years is to kind of focus on what I'm best at, and that's making models and developing analytics. I'm a fine handicapper, but I'm not as good at that as I am at building models. And so I've really kind of focused definitely more in the off season on doing that. So I guess maybe I would say just kind of focus on your strengths, know what your strengths are. And really, I mean, it's not going to be the only thing that you do, but maybe just focus on your strengths and go from there and see where it leads.
Well said. Well, as we start to round the corner here, got a quick ask for everybody who's still with us. Clearly, if you are still with us, that's a sign that you're enjoying this conversation. If you're here on YouTube, would appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe to the Props and Hops channel. On Twitter, if you could go ahead and like this post, repost it, follow Ed at the Power Rank. You can follow the show at Props and Hops Pod, as well as myself at Lay of the Landis. And if you're with us in podcast form, it would be great if you could take just 5 seconds to leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and also subscribe to this show so that new episodes will automatically appear in your podcast feed. Last but not least, however you're listening, friendly reminder that you can support this show by supporting Right Angle Sports. Custom link to do so, tinyurl.com/raspicks, or via YouTube and the podcast. You'll find that link in the show notes, and on Twitter, again, that link is in the bio. Ed, thanks for all the ground you've covered on the Week 5 card. Appreciate the time as always. I want to make sure to remind everybody to follow your work, thepowerrank.com, the free Power Rank email newsletter, your podcast, The Football Analytics Show, and once again on Twitter at the Power Rank. Once again, I know we've done this with college basketball for March Madness a few times, but it was long overdue to finally work a conversation with you focused on the NFL into this podcast. And as I touched on earlier in the Hop segment, I am already looking forward to our next craft beer share at Bet Bash 4.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, Matt.
And to those of you watching and listening, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of Thursday Night Football if you can bring yourself to do so, and enjoy the Week 5 slate in the NFL, and best of luck with your bets this weekend.